You know, whenever the virgin birth comes up, the conversation always seems to get bogged down in ancient history or these really obscure translations. But what if we're all missing the real conflict? What if the debate isn't actually about historical facts at all, but about the fundamental rulebook we use to decide what's even true in the first place? It's really a clash of two totally different worldviews. So let's unpack that.
And that brings us to the big question, right? Was the story of the virgin birth something that was, invented later on and added to the narrative for theological reasons? Or was it an original truth that just got lost or maybe wasn't recorded perfectly over time? This is the core conflict we're going to dive into.
All right, so first up, let's explore the case made by a lot of modern biblical scholars. They use this method called historical criticism. And what that really means is they approach the Bible just like they'd approach any other ancient document. They kind of set aside the divine element for a minute to analyze how and why the text itself was actually put together.
And when you look at it through that lens, they come to a pretty startling conclusion. The virgin birth wasn't part of the original Christian message. They argue it was an idea that developed much later, added to the story for very specific theological purposes.
Okay, so if that's the claim, what's the evidence? Well, it all boils down to a couple of key arguments based on what we find, and maybe more importantly, what we don't find in the earliest Christian texts.
The first major piece of evidence is what people often call the argument from silence. And it's pretty simple, really. If you go back and read the earliest Christian writings, the doctrine is just not there. The Apostle Paul never mentions it. The Gospel of Mark, which most scholars think was written first, starts with Jesus' baptism, not his birth. It's only decades later in Matthew and Luke that the story suddenly appears. For a historian, that silence is deafening. It suggests the idea just hadn't been developed yet.
The second argument zeroes in on the key proof used in the Gospel of Matthew, this claim that the virgin birth fulfilled an Old Testament prophecy. But critics argue this prophecy was actually misunderstood and taken way out of its original context.
The whole issue starts with a single word. The original Hebrew, alma, just means young woman. It doesn't necessarily mean virgin. On top of that, the prophecy itself was about an immediate political crisis that was happening in Isaiah's own time. So the critical view is that early Christians basically went back, found this verse, and retroactively applied it to Jesus, giving it a new meaning to fit their theological goal.
Okay, so that's the historical critical case in a nutshell. It seems pretty straightforward, right? But what if this entire method, this rulebook that says the oldest text is the highest authority, what if it's built on a set of assumptions that not everyone accepts?
This brings us to a completely different perspective. We'll call it the Latter-day Saint reframing. And this approach doesn't just argue about the specific points, it fundamentally changes the whole rulebook for how we even understand divine truth.
At the absolute core of this alternative view is a powerful idea. Truth isn't created by ancient texts. Instead, it can be disclosed directly by God, and it exists completely independently of whatever human records just so happen to survive the centuries.
This leads us to a foundational principle. Revelation precedes the record. The idea here is that God reveals a truth first. The scriptures we have are just a partial, sometimes flawed, and often incomplete record of that original divine event. So the record isn't the source of the truth, it's just a reflection of it.
Now, this completely reframes that argument from silence. From this perspective, just because Paul or Mark didn't write about the virgin birth doesn't mean it wasn't a known truth. It could mean they were teaching a specific audience, or that the full teaching was simply lost over time and needed to be restored, not that it was a later fabrication.
So when you step back, what we have are two fundamentally different systems for knowing. This isn't just a simple disagreement over the evidence. It's a clash of the very rule books we use to interpret it.
Let's just put them side by side. In the critic's framework, Scripture creates doctrine, so the earliest text you can find is king. Any development in the text is seen as a later invention. But in the restoration framework, revelation comes before the record. Divine disclosure from God is the highest authority, and any gaps you see in the text are just evidence of loss that requires, restoration.
And this really gets to the heart of it. From this viewpoint, you can't debunk acclaimed revelation just by showing that earlier texts are incomplete. In fact, the very incompleteness of the ancient record is the whole reason modern revelation would be necessary in the first place.
So let's zoom out for a second. After looking at both sides, what's the fundamental conflict here? What is this debate really about when you get right down to it?
Look, the historical critical method is an incredibly useful tool. It's fantastic for telling us how ancient texts were written and how they developed. Its purpose is to describe what's inside the historical record. But it was never designed to make a final ruling on what God has or has not revealed outside of that record. It's just not the right tool for that job.
So you see, the debate isn't really about the translation of one Hebrew word, and it's not really about what Paul did or didn't write. It's about a much, much deeper question of authority. Who or what gets the final say in defining what is true when it comes to God?
And that's really what it all comes down to. Who is the final authority on divine truth? Is it the historical record, as analyzed and interpreted by scholars, or is it ongoing, direct revelation from God? That is the fundamental question at the heart of this entire debate.